This is lesson 20.3, New Patterns of Working and Living. How did work evolve during the Industrial Revolution, and how did daily life change for working people? And we've got College Board Topic 6.4, Social Effects of Industrialization. Explain the causes and consequences, that's cause and effect, of social developments resulting from industrialization. In industrialized areas of Europe, i.e. Western and Northern Europe, socioeconomic changes created divisions of labor that led to the development of self-conscious classes, including the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. And in this presentation, we see the beginning of that process as we transition in three areas simultaneously and interrelatedly, from rural to urban, from cottage to factory, and from family employment to individual employment. I think I wrote that part. And so the place is basically back to England, Wales, and Scotland, time frame 1780 to 1850. Key concepts of new patterns of working and living: the Factory Acts, separate spheres, the Mines Act of 1842, and the working class. Key people of new patterns of working and living: we've got Robert Owen, 1771 to 1858, and we've got Sir Robert Peel, 1788 to 1850. Intro. Factories slowly started moving from the country to the city. Steam engines, unlike rivers, could be located anywhere. People had to follow the factories to the cities. Many people were uprooted from their rural communities, and the workforce shifted from pauper children to men and women. Many women continued to work. Those who worked tended to be single or poor. Married women often left the workforce entirely. Living conditions for the workers got worse for them rather than better. Living conditions in overcrowded, underdeveloped cities were difficult and even dangerous, and these conditions stayed worse for several decades until about 1850. The early Industrial Revolution. In those early years, industry was still very rural. Whole families sometimes worked together in mills and mines, and it was kind of a carryover from the old putting out system. Owners often contracted with the father for the whole family's employment. Cottage industry / putting out system workers migrated to factories only very reluctantly. Keeping up with the machine was hard. The hours were long and monotonous. You had to be there on time. It was noisy. It was unclean. It was often hazardous. You had a boss constantly on your case. You had all these rules, and you could be fined for breaking the rules. Your kids could be beaten. Another thing was that early factories looked just like poorhouses, and poorhouses is where destitute people lived on government expense. Poorhouses systematically and by design degraded and humiliated the people who had to turn to them in every possible way. If men and women won't go into the factory, what do? You turn to pauper, quote, apprentices, in other words, children. As we talked about last time, mill owners contracted with local orphanages to get their workers. Children didn't get a say in the matter, and the work and the discipline could be brutal. But let's not judge these guys too harshly. Like I said, this was uncharted territory. This transition had never before occurred in the history of man. Children had always worked in the home, on the farm, in the mines, and people didn't see working at the factory as being significantly different. The social and economic ramifications of the factory system were extremely difficult to predict. How did child labor get reduced? Well, two things happened beginning in the 1790s. Number one, factories started moving to the cities, and you could find more workers in the city. Steam power was replacing water power. This made factories more footloose, and people who came to the cities for urban wage earner jobs became a new class, the working class. The other thing that happened was that the Factory Acts progressively started taking kids out of factories between 1802 and 1833. So what caused the Factory Acts? The increasing technical sophistication of factories eventually made the family factory impossible. The whole process became more impersonal. Overseers started treating the kids more harshly, and adults started protesting. Robert Owen was the most high-profile protester. He was a manufacturer himself, and he argued that the factory was physically damaging to children. And he also argued that child labor didn't help the manufacturers either. And he got Parliament involved in the debate over child labor. So what were some specific factory acts? Number one, a maximum workday. Number two, minimum safety standards. Number three, minimum hygiene standards. This is a really important one for kids, age restrictions. And number five, professional inspectors. What were the consequences of these factory acts? Well, the convention of whole families working in factories became a thing of the past. Standardized shifts for all workers emerged. Sexual division of labor, in other words, separate spheres, emerged. It's much harder for mom to work in the factory now. She can't bring her kids to work anymore. And dad now becomes the primary wage earner because mom now stays at home. Separate spheres, a major development in women's history. After having their first child, married women were much less likely to work outside the home for good reason. You couldn't work a machine and take care of an infant. And taking a break to nurse or to rest was impossible. Running a household was extremely demanding. There were no supermarkets like we have today. You had to go to every little individual shop. There were no cars. You walked everywhere. There were no washing machines. You did it all by hand. There were no microwaves. You cooked by hand, from scratch. And many women simply accepted the new culture of separate spheres out of relief from sheer exhaustion. When married women with children did work, they tended to be the poorest. They did it only out of the most dire necessity. Unmarried women tended to work only menial jobs. These were low-paying and dead-end. Segregation and inequality came to the workplace. There had been jobs that were seen culturally as men's work and women's work, and the workplace took on this culture. Segregation at the workplace was seen as an institutional way of controlling the sexuality of working-class youth. Unplanned pregnancies were increasing. The illegitimacy explosion was happening. Separate spheres in the mining industry. Men, women, and children had worked together in the mines. But in a mine, you don't wear much. Clothes get really dirty, and it's really hot. So mines were dangerous places for women and children to work in. There was lots of darkness and isolation down there, and some men just aren't very trustworthy. So you had the Mines Act of 1842, and it said two things. Number one, no women or girls could work in the mines at all. And number two, no boys under 10 could work in the mines. Some women protested because the money from working in mines was pretty good. But most women supported the Mines Act. Separate spheres because of domestic ideals. A reform ideology emerged at this time, and it encouraged women to stay at home, take care of their families. Living standards. Did they improve? Wages started rising after about 1815, but this was more than offset by the loss of women and children adding to the household income. Real wages, adjusted for inflation, didn't start going up substantially till about 1840, after 70 years of sharp industrial growth. By 1850, they were about 30% more than they had been in 1770. And people worked a lot more. Many more hours per day, many more days per year. Small towns were completely unready to become large towns. There was no social services, no infrastructure. Life expectancy dropped. Infant mortality climbed. The rural village culture disappeared. And so now you've got feelings of anonymity. You've got feelings of loneliness, a loss of work autonomy. There were some improvements. Cotton clothing became affordable. Transportation for the masses increased. Communication increased with the telegraph. Gas lighting made the streets safer. You could actually go out at night. Vaccines became routine. And there was a greater variety of foods, all because of the Industrial Revolution.